In a troubled world of ever-increasing violence and conflict, the name Carl Rogers stands out. A name synonymous with tolerance, understanding and respect amongst people for one another. Dr. Rogers, whose approach has been used in many international conferences, including the Camp David negotiations of Presidents Carter and Sadat and Premier Begin, has come to South Africa in an attempt to promote an environment of tolerance and respect amongst all the people of this country. Dr. Rogers, your approach, which is used in therapy and counselling throughout the world, is person-centred. Now, I want to ask you how you have taken your work from the individual to the group situation.
I've been interested in that question myself. How did I come to be interested in such a wide range of things going outward from individual therapy? I think it's the fact that at heart I'm a scientist as well as a therapist, and I feel if we have discovered some principles which apply to an individual relationship, an individual helping relationship, then it ought to be true that they would apply in other situations as well. And we've found that that is very much true in education, for example, that the teacher who can create a trusting kind of climate, an understanding kind of climate for the class gets much more productivity, much more creativity out of the students. We've found that family life can be very different depending upon the kind of climate that parents create for the children.
You use the term unconditional caring, which is very interesting to us because last year we had an interview on television with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who used the term unconditional love.
I think there are moments when a teacher feels that way towards students, really feels, really, you're quite a group, I like you as you are. Okay, that creates a very desirable climate. Parents certainly feel that way at times. And it's at those times that growth, change, self-understanding are most likely to occur.
With what's happening in the world today, there seems to be a great absence of unconditional caring.
Very definitely. I feel that a great many of the problems of the world, probably including terrorism, come about because of the fact that so many people today are alienated, feel no one cares, no one understands, no one gives a damn. And so they begin to develop hostile and really vicious attitudes that are completely removed from any warm personal relationships.
Is it a need to dominate others? Because this seems to be the feeling that one has, that each country wants to dominate the other.
Certainly the question of power is very much involved, and that's one thing that we feel we've learned in therapy and in education. If the therapist has a need for power over the client, then he or she is going to be the expert who directs the client. If they're willing to share power, then I think much more exciting things happen. And that's been my experience too in teaching, that some teachers seem to feel a need for power over the group, and so that's the way they operate. if they can get to the point where they're willing to share power with the members of the group, then people become more confident, more self-directing, more creative, more exciting things happen.
You recently ran a workshop in Northern Ireland composed of Protestants, Catholics, and English. Now, what actually ensued from that?
When we started, the bitterness in both the Catholics and Protestants was really intense because they'd had awful experiences. One man told how his sister, who'd just come to visit him, went out on the street and was blown to bits by a bomb. He didn't know for sure whether it was a Protestant or Catholic bomb. All he knew was that this terror was in the streets. Another man had to barricade his family with mattresses and so on because there was so much shooting going on in the street outside. A lot of bitterness. One young woman saying that if she saw an IRA man lying on the street wounded, she'd step on him. So what I'm saying is there was real anger, real bitterness. And yet the thing that seemed really miraculous to us was that in the space of 16 hours, which is all we had money for to keep the group together, in the space of 16 hours, those attitudes reduced, dissolved, changed to a degree that the group was being filmed. We had to eliminate some things from the film because if it had been shown back in Belfast, and this man had been shown, this Protestant man had been showing such understanding of this Catholic woman, he probably would have been shot. We had to eliminate some of the best things from the film just for security reasons. And we wondered, well, a lot of changes seemed to happen in that time. Did they last? Well, over the course of the next year, it was quite fascinating that without any funding from us, without any funding from anywhere, the group decided to stay together, to meet at the home of the British colonel, which was the safest place they could find. They went out in pairs, one Protestant and one Catholic, to show the film to schools and churches and so on. And during that time, 4 copies of that film, which were very expensive, were destroyed by paramilitary groups from the extreme Catholic, the extreme Protestant area. Because the paramilitary groups did not want that film to be shown because it showed that reconciliation was possible, that centuries of prejudice and so on could be reduced in one weekend.
Dr. Rogers, how?
I think the changes in that group came about because we were able quite genuinely to accept the extreme differences of attitudes, the bitterness of this young Irish girl, the fear in the part of the mother of some Catholic boys and so on. All feelings were accepted and became a real part of the situation. And once extreme feelings are accepted, they become less irrational. They become more a fact in the situation. And people find them easier to deal with. Also, if I can understand the bitterness of a Protestant and the hatred of a Catholic, then each one becomes a little better able to understand the other. They realize, oh, he's understanding them. Maybe it's possible to understand them rather than just hate them or whatever. So that little by little attitudes tend to, especially irrational attitudes, tend to dissolve, and the attitudes become real. And in that situation, real solutions are much more possible. People become not so convinced that I'm right and you're wrong, but more convinced that perhaps I think I'm right, but I see you have a reason to feel you're right too. So then there's a possibility of getting together. I think that's what tends to dissolve the bitternesses.
Doesn't it lead to a verbal wrangling, even mudslinging?
That's where the skills of the facilitator are very important, where it becomes important to break in, if need be, to say, all right, I understand how much you dislike this person. That's understood. Now, what do you have to say? In other words, we keep it from becoming just a hopeless wrangle. And very deep feelings can be expressed and accepted without it becoming a battle. And we've seen that in so many intercultural situations, international situations. Just recently, we were able to get together a group that I dreamed about for a long time, a group of international leaders all focused on the Central American crisis, with former presidents and senators and ambassadors, and it was really quite a high-level group, including people from many other nations as well, but all interested in the Central American problem. And there was quite a little reluctance to express strong feelings. These were diplomats. They're accustomed to being nice to each other. But in the small groups especially, some of the really hostile feelings began to come out. And certainly, although that one was only 4 days long, the degree of mutual trust that developed and the reduction of suspicion and the reduction of mistrust was quite outstanding. And to have, I don't know how much you people are acquainted with this, but to have the Nicaraguan representative and a conservative from the United States developing close personal bonds and coming to really understand each other's point of view and agreeing that they would try to present to their governments ways in which their two countries could comfortably coexist, that was quite something.
How much of this can they actually carry away with them, and for how long?
Well, that's why I mentioned what happened after the Belfast thing. We know that it can carry on for a long time afterward. I'm sure that not all of the intentions that are experienced in a brief group actually get carried through, but many of them do.
Dr. Rogers, you mentioned the word prejudice earlier. It's fairly well established, I believe, that racial prejudice is established by the age of 11. How would you see such long-standing prejudice being broken down?
I've had a good deal of experience working with groups where prejudice is a factor, and I think that it can be definitely reduced in a situation where the climate that I spoke of exists, where people feel free to be as prejudiced as they are, and yet to realize that they're expressing this to the person about whom they feel the prejudices. I recall when we were here before, one black man telling how bitter he was about being invisible, how he went to a butcher shop and nobody waited on him, and nobody waited on him, and nobody waited on him, until finally a white woman said, "This man's been waiting a long time," and so he was waited on. But he felt so bitter about being invisible. Yet to express that and find it accepted and find it understood was a real healing of the bitterness. And I feel that the unspoken prejudice begins to come out too. We're all of us much more prejudiced than we think we are. And some of that begins to be evident when people are open enough to say, well, that's a sexist remark, or, well, you've said that because of the color of my skin, or something like that. We begin to be aware of those elements in ourselves, and it's that awareness that makes it possible to reduce prejudice.
You say this is easy to do in small groups, but how would it actually work on a large scale?
I feel that we have a chance here this time to deal with some of the prejudices and feelings, strong feelings, negative feelings that exist. I know because I've seen them in blacks versus whites and whites versus blacks, blacks versus blacks, the tribal issue. I realize how important that is. Whites versus whites, English and Afrikaners don't always love each other. And then the blacks and colored and so on. I see a great welter of prejudice and strong negative feeling here. But the thing that struck us so when we were here last time, and I've just arrived this time, so I can't say as to now. The thing that struck us so when we were here last time was the tremendous hunger for communication. I feel that the governmental system in your country has not only separated races and classifications, it seems to have had a side effect of separating people from people, persons from persons, so that we found Afrikaners having difficulty communicating with Afrikaners and blacks with blacks. But there was such a hunger for deeper, more real communication. And it's that gives me some degree of hope that on a small scale we can show that some of these attitudes are not necessary, can be dissolved, can be dealt with. And then the scientist in me says, and if they can be dealt with in relatively small groups, then someone should be able to extend those ideas into larger and larger areas.
Once again, how?
Well, you see, you are asking me for the final answers, and I don't pretend to know that. I think, well, I'll just mention one thing from our Belfast experience. It's clear that the work we did with one small group from Belfast didn't have any effect on any measurable effect on what went on in Belfast then or later. But as one man from Belfast said, if there had been a group like that on every block, that would have made a difference. And to continue with the Belfast example, if governments, if society had been willing to spend the money that was spent on just British occupation, say, there would have been funds for a group on every block. It's that at the present time, I sometimes see what we're doing as a little bit analogous to the early days of flying. So the Wright brothers took off for a few feet on the beach. What significance has that? It doesn't have any social significance. Until society gets excited, when they find that Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, then maybe there is something to flight. Maybe we can use it. Maybe it has possibilities. And so we came over in the Concorde. In other words, if things can be done on a small scale, they have implications for the larger scale. And that's why I feel it is not insignificant if we can show that in relatively small groups, people can reduce prejudices. That's why we're focusing in this trip on helping to train people who will be interested in facilitating communication between black and black, black and white, whatever.
So the people you train, you see them going out into the community, forming more groups, and gradually more groups forming.
I've seen this happen enough that I feel that whatever the basic cause of those prejudices, they can be reduced. They're not hopeless. I'm not saying they will be totally eliminated. I still find ways in which my daughter feels I'm hopelessly imbued with a male domination point of view. I know that I still have some racial prejudice that I can't completely eliminate. But such things can be reduced, and the more we are aware of them, the better we will handle the prejudices we have. It's quite one thing to be unconsciously macho, for example, and deal with women as subservient and inadequate and inefficient and so forth. It's quite another thing to be aware of those attitudes in oneself and realize they're not realistic. They don't match the facts. And it's the same way with any kind of prejudice. The more we can become aware of them, the better we will handle them.
I've often heard it said by black people in this country, please don't evaluate me as a black person. Please look at me as a person. Do you think this is possible after centuries of prejudice?
Yes, because none of us have experienced centuries of prejudice. We've only experienced what has happened in our lifetimes, and that, I think, is possible to deal with. We saw that same kind of thing. I'll use another example. In this last conference on Central America, to some people, the fact that the Nicaraguans were communists, that settles it. They're bad. To discover that they are persons, that they're not bad, was really a very valuable product of the conference. And I feel that the same thing is true here. I quite understand what the black person is saying, that it is communication and cooperation helped along by a facilitative environment that enable people to see one another as separate persons, different, diverse, but separate and valuable.
Dr. Rogers, how do you see change occurring if both sides come to the negotiating table with preset conditions?
Let me put it this way. If two groups are willing to come into the same room together to talk with each other, then I have hope. If they refuse to even be in the same room with each other, it's still possible sometimes, but that gets very difficult. But my experience has been that if two groups are willing to sit down in the same room with a facilitator present, or perhaps a staff of facilitators, then there is hope of real communication beginning. And one thing that, for example, in your country, I'm sure the concern about violence must be very real. Will this turn into a violent eruption? I don't know. All I know is that violence always has to be followed by talk. I mean, in places where there are violent revolutions, eventually someone has to talk with, the two sides have to talk with one another to settle the issue. And I'm hoping that we can at least start a process of communication, of expression of real feeling and development of real understanding of one another before violence erupts.
But what if one party refuses to renounce violence?
That wouldn't stop me from trying to work with them if they're willing to meet with the other group and talk. Because then whether or not they're going to use violence is still a choice. And as long as it's still a choice, I'd be quite willing to meet with them. And let me stress again, I don't pretend to have the answer to all of the problems of this highly complex country. I see some things that we can do that I hope may be of some significant help.
We know the old story that violence begets violence. How is it possible to break the cycle of violence?
By someone breaking it and saying, I'm willing to talk. That's a very simplistic answer, and I know it doesn't fit all situations, but the willingness to negotiate, to discuss, to thrash out differences is basic, I think, to the reduction of violence. And one other thing, too, that I think is particularly important, that I realized very keenly when I was here before. When the dispute is between a powerless group and those with power, then in ordinary life, discussion, negotiation becomes really impossible. The powerful just have all the say. If the powerless group can get together in the same room with the group that has power, then a facilitator can grant them both equal power in that situation, so that the expressions of those in the powerless group have just as much weight as the feelings of those in the power group. And that makes a tremendous difference in the kind of exchange that takes place. To be sure, when the group breaks up, then they go back to their perhaps previous situation. But something has happened that can't be undone.
Do you feel that two groups can truly relate to each other when each one fears domination by the other?
Yes, I think definitely they can, providing those fears can be really out in the open. In this small opportunity we had here in 1982 to hear the whites expressing their fear of black domination, to hear the blacks expressing their fear of greater oppression and so on, was not only informative, it helped to bring the two groups closer together. And the fact that that does make a difference is shown by the fact that when my colleague Ruth Sanford and I were here in 1982, one of the questions that hit us most as we were ending our sessions was, how can we get training in facilitation? And we had no answer. We didn't know. Now it's quite fascinating to me that this time we come back with that as our primary aim, because that's what people want, is to learn how could we facilitate better communication between groups that fear each other or feel bitterness toward each other, feel prejudice toward each other.
How do you see your approach being transformed into reality, you know, when one talks of vast numbers in a society?
I see the possibility of it being transformed into a reality when it is backed by a social will. That's why I gave the analogy of flight, of airplanes. it wasn't until society decided we want this that it came about. I feel that what we are doing is of test tube size. It's, you know, it's minute compared to the problem. But if society should get the notion that, hey, this is helpful, we would like to use this, there is no reason under the sun why it couldn't be multiplied, why it couldn't be improved, why it couldn't be done on a much more massive scale. I think at the present time, humanistic psychology, the behavioral sciences, the person-centered approach are regarded by society as something they know very little about, they don't have any confidence in. But if small groups begin to feel this is something which can be effective, then society has the capacity to transform that into a mass approach. I don't think it can be done by propaganda. I don't think it can be done by organization, or that would be necessary. There's got to be a change in the social perception of what's possible, and then society will say, we want this, and then it'll come about.
Do you think it's possible to reach such a climate of understanding when it's impossible to actually experience the other person's life?
I think that the progress can be made on that. I think that's one of the values of the empathic listening that the facilitator does in a group. For example, I mentioned before the black man who felt he was invisible in the butcher shop. When he got through telling that incident, there wasn't a person in the room who didn't have a better feeling of what it was like to be waiting to be served and finding people ignoring you and ignoring you and ignoring you, and realize that that's a part of the black experience. And when a black mother was telling the difficulty she had in trying to help her children realize that black is beautiful, that it's fine to be black, that it's okay to be a black person, that you are a person. The difficulties of being a black parent really became evident. So I think that not all at once, but by degrees, people do begin to realize what it is like to be black, what it is like to be different in any way, what it's like to be handicapped, what it's like to be Catholic in Belfast, and so forth. I think that the more that we tend to develop empathy, and I might say that the reason that the facilitator, or one of the byproducts of the facilitator trying intensely to really understand what it's like to be in your world, is that tends to be learned by other people as well, that they begin to develop an understanding of what it's like to be black, to be Catholic, to be whatever.
Tell me, Dr. Rogers, why, when we live in a world of ever-improving communication skills, do we also have ever-escalating violence and conflict?
It is a puzzling and baffling problem that we seem to become better in everything. Not only in communication, but in the skills of violence. Quarrels that used to be just small border quarrels now have submachine guns and artillery and planes and so on, and they become real wars. It seems as though our problems escalate along with our means of coping with them.
Do you think that it's ever too late to talk?
No, I don't think so. I don't believe it's ever too late to really, and by talk I mean now, to really communicate with another person. I feel that it is never too late to try to understand the person with whom I differ, the person whom I dislike, the person against whom I feel prejudice. It's never too late for me to try to gain understanding of that person.
Well,